Good evening, and welcome to Suffering in Silence with Tia May on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We're here every Friday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern. Luv Bay family, we're rising out of the ashes together. Our topic on tonight is sex trafficking and domestic violence. Our co-host for this evening is Jen Peterkin, and our guest for this evening is Rebecca Baylog of Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. Listeners, if you have any questions or comments for our guest or co-host, you can email us at sufferinginsilencedv@gmail.com. If you have resources that you would like to share with us on a national or local level from your country, community, your local organizations, or your faith community, you can also email us at sufferinginsilencedv@gmail.com. Jen, you want to greet our listeners on this evening?
Yeah, it is so good to be here again with all of you. 2 weeks in a row. I am really honored to be here once again. So my name is Jen Peterkin. I am a domestic violence advocate. I've been a domestic violence advocate for about 8 years after going through my own abusive relationship. Right now I'm working on launching a project called The Human Experience, where we tell stories, people's stories, and how our experiences change our perspective on the world and who we are and how we relate to other people. So the blog isn't launched quite yet, but for the time being, you can follow me on Instagram at GetTheHX.
Thank you. Rebecca, please introduce yourself.
Abeta Washday. Good evening to you all. Hi, Rebecca Baylog here. I am nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of the Appalachians of Pennsylvania. My home office is in Minnesota and a part of Indian country in the anti-violence work. I am so grateful to be here today. Some of the side hustle things I do, I'm Native American and Gypsy. My father's a full-blooded Gypsy. So I love to hear things like the human experience because storytelling is very traditional across many of our nations. So yeah, let's talk about the human experience tonight and what that means. Thank you. Wabila.
Thank you so much. So listeners, as usual, we want to start with sharing some resources. First, we have Polaris Project, Polaris, the Polaris Project National Human Trafficking Hotline. Their number is 1-888-373-7888, or you can text Be Free to 233-733. And their website is www.polarisproject.org. We also have the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. Their website is www.pcar.org. We have Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, also known as RAIN. Their website is www.rainn.org. And we have the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Their website is www.nsvrc.org. And again, listeners, on tonight, our topic is sex trafficking and domestic violence. And Jen, I will turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Tia. I am just really excited to be here with Rebecca tonight. And Rebecca, I really want you to lead this conversation. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of getting into what your story is and the work that you do with the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition.
Maye, thank you. I'm so grateful to be here and talk about a little bit about Indian country and tribal history, intergenerational trauma and violence, but also my little side gig with consulting is called Hybrid Love Stories. And besides that, When we talk about hybrid love, we're talking about the intersections, right? And that means that I am Native American and Gypsy. I am a Romani from Hungary. So there's the love stories of intersections of identity, intersections of sexual orientation and the LGBTQ community. There's intersections specifically with trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault, and murdered and missing, right? Like this journey that we're going to talk about today includes homelessness, substance abuse, veterans, child abuse, domestic violence, all the things. It's one big hybrid love intersection. And at the end of that, we're working together across all of our nations, across the globe, to end trafficking. And man, we want to end domestic violence. So I'm really grateful to be here today to talk about some of those things and also inform. Here in North America, we include Canadian bands of American Indians. The United States with Alaska and Hawaii, they are indigenous folks. And then Mexico. And then we go global, where many of our people, including the Irish, come from tribal backgrounds. And what does that mean? And how do we link our arms together to just end it? Taking a breath. Because trafficking, right, is a huge pipeline for all of our nations that can be very similar. And when we talk about the kennels where trafficking survivors and victims tonight are sitting in enslavement through the force, the fraud, and coercion, they are sitting in a room of the Rainbow Coalition of Victims and Survivors, while we are sitting here as a Rainbow Coalition of people talking about it. So yeah, I'm really stoked to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. After just that interview or just that introduction, I'm already excited about this conversation. So I would love to talk about specifically, we're just going to dive right in here. The intersection between domestic violence and sexual assault and human trafficking. Because I think a lot of people tend to separate those issues in their head, right? And especially with something like human trafficking, like it seems so far out there. And then even with things like domestic violence and sexual assault, we tend to romanticize certain things in our head about those issues. And I think it's really important to talk about the fact that a lot of that trauma is parallel or overlaps with each other, because a lot of that is about power and control, right? There's nothing romantic about any of that. All of these situations exist because of power, too many people having power over other people. So since you have obviously the most experience in this realm, I would love for you to talk about the intersections there.
Well, Bila, thank you. I want to open with a bit of a storytelling to share the space with your listeners. I am a survivor of child abuse, sexual violence, rape, and domestic violence. So I do come as a survivor advocate, and what my sisters in the movement are now calling survivor leadership. And I love that language. It's very empowering and kind of gives us a sense of freedom and ownership over our story. So I want to open with a shout out to Jessica Smith, who is an Ojibwe Anishinaabe woman who gave me that language. But yeah, so like to backtrack a little bit, and I have it up, the power and control, right? That is what identifies a lot of sex trafficking experiences, domestic violence, sexual assault, and that other, right? We're still working on these intersections of other, and murdered and missing is really unbalanced in historical investigations. With now we have MMIR, murdered and missing Indigenous relatives, which is a movement that's really taken traction. That also intersects across our nations and across all of the acts of violence, right? So I just wanted to mention that. But specifically with sex trafficking, with the intersection of domestic violence. So in Minnesota, again, I'm from the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. In that state, they're very progressive. They wrote The Garden of Truth. That is an interview with 105 survivors of sex trafficking that are Native women and people of color. It's available on our website, www.miwsac.org. So the Garden of Truth is a really good resource to hear the voices of 105 interviewees on what trafficking journey has been. That includes a grandmother that has rolled in a child into sex trafficking through historical trauma and family ties to the avenues and pipelines of life, right? To someone who got rolled in to being in the life, quote unquote, which is sex trafficking, through a pack of ramen noodles because they were hungry as a runaway on the street. So that's like a spectrum of how people enter sex trafficking. And then there's the escort, which is Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. So it's really from a runaway 12-year-old to an echelon of financial benefits at the upper escort level, right? So it's all the things.
Yeah.
But I digress. So I want to just talk real briefly about the Duluth model out of Minnesota with domestic violence. It's called the power and control wheel because all violence is based on power and control, whether that's discrimination, racial justice, homelessness, substance abuse, or the domestic violence, sexual violence spectrum. It's all power and control, right? That's what harm doers count on. So in the Duluth model, it's called the domestic violence power and control wheel. We have using coercion and threats in domestic violence. Now, the federal definition of sex trafficking is 3 words: force and fraud and coercion, right? So at the basic level, sex trafficking starts with the first quadrant of that pie of the description of what domestic violence is: force, fraud, and coercion. Yeah. Intimidation is relevant because those that are in the life through force, fraud, and coercion are constantly intimidated through acts of violence. Emotional abuse, that's where that piece comes in with the example of ramen noodles. Someone was hungry, they were in need, and someone came forth to utilize that need and profit from it and enter them into the cycle of sex trafficking through ramen noodles, which is really specific and odd, but that's how it can be sometimes. Sure. The emotional abuse of keeping people in the life. No one wants you. No one will believe you. If you go for help, everyone will judge you. No one's going to see you the same, and it's going to destroy your life. These are things we've heard from survivors. And then, of course, the basics across Asian and Pacific Islanders, Black, Hispanic, isolation. And that's the word kennel. When someone has a building in suburbia, in the city, in a rural mountain town, or on the reservation, you isolate your kennel, which means a group of people you're trafficking. And that's not gender specific. We know that, right? So they isolate and use emotional abuse, intimidation, and coercion. And then the last thing, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole too long because I know we have limited time, but that financial abuse. We are, I want to give honor and respect here. So we work with many survivors of sex trafficking in our work because survivors need to drive the bus when we do this work, right? And that financial abuse can be a trigger when they're doing consultant work, when they become professionals officially in their business suits and their hair buns in this movement, whatever that looks like, that their financial, their equity, the amount of money they make per year or per hour is a trigger because their entire life in the life of sex trafficking has been based on what their quota and their dollar amount has been worth. And that can lead to a lifelong struggle. So I say that to remind everyone who's working with trafficking victims that whether it's secondary or first degree trauma, that's something that's really hard to navigate sometimes because their abuse has been based on their dollar. So when we're working with survivor advocates, we need to remember that and be conscious of that when we're negotiating contracts of a survivor that can speak today. that was a rabbit hole. I went, yeah, I'm going to take a breath. Any comments to that?
No problem. I mean, we've talked about the power and control wheel several times on this show before, because it's honestly such a good resource for people to really understand this issue on a very basic level, and in ways that, you know, we as a society don't necessarily present. So we always love when that gets brought up as a resource, because it really is such a good tool to use to help understand these issues. And obviously we just appreciate so much the work that you have been doing, and your organization has been doing to bring this to the forefront. On your website, you have so many resources and so many things that you guys do to advocate and to offer education, which I think is a really big tool. Can you talk about what community education looks like for you?
Wow, that's a great question, because it looks different everywhere we go. So when we provide, MILSAC, the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, that's such a tongue tie. We are comprehensive. So we're funded by the Office on Violence Against Women to do comprehensive. So that means attorneys in the courtroom, prosecutors, law enforcement, elders, traditional elders that don't even have internet, right? From Alaska to Hawaii to all the tribes, and people that are in urban, rural, suburban, and reservation. So the work that we do is culturally specific, but also with that hybrid love intersection of folks might be in an urban setting where there's one Native family that's going to a mainstream organization to get culturally specific advocacy, right? So we try to really be comprehensive and just problem solve where they're at. So the resources that we have on our website, we try to focus on Indian country. But man, with that hybrid love philosophy, that's really a big spectrum, because we have Black Indigenous that have to code switch all the time, and white and Indigenous mixed that have to code switch all the time. So our resources go to specifically to that identity of the complexities of Indian country and what that historical trauma and American history leans into. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. I noticed that you have like a 40-hour training specifically for Indian country and what that issue looks like within that setting, which I think is really interesting, because Pennsylvania is one of the only states in the country that you have to take a training to become an official domestic violence advocate in. And it's around the same hours, I believe. So, I mean, that really is just such a comprehensive training that you offer. And I think it's fantastic.
Can I chime? Oh man. So I'm here nestled. I am Gypsy and Native, right, in Pennsylvania. So thank you. Wow. That's so, I'm going to summarize, but that's a great statement. So Indian country is very complicated with identities, because you are not identified on any check boxes on any form if you don't have a blood quantum card, which I'm using the language of others, which is the equivalent to having a dog pedigree at the American Kennel Club, right? Wow. So the blood quantum is specific. Pennsylvania, all of the tribes here, the Conewago, the Tuscarora, the Susquehannock, and many others are extinct because of colonization and the Indian Wars and the oppression and all that has happened in our history. So here I sit in Pennsylvania, born and raised, without any tribes relevant in our state. So that's a little bit of Native history. And I want to add that the very first boarding school that was created for only Native folks, where children were stolen from their homes with their mothers crying. I can't go too deep. It'll take all of our time. Native children were stolen with a government propaganda of, if you want to save the man, you must kill the Indian. And that is 15 minutes from my home. And my little boys, they've grown up. They're not little anymore. They're teenagers. But we cleaned the graves of the children that had passed on there. But they were stolen from Alaska, from all 50 states and Canada, and brought into this little army barracks left over from the Civil War to cut off their hair. I apologize for this trigger warning, but they would cut off their fingers. They would beat them and sexually assault them if they spoke their own language. But they came from like the Seminole Nation, and they came from the Yurok in Alaska and the Tlingit in Washington. They didn't speak English. So if they said, I don't understand in their language, they would be beaten, and sometimes their fingers were cut off, right? So please check out the Carlisle Indian School if you want to learn more on Google. There's a huge story on that. So that is the uniqueness of being a native in Pennsylvania. But bringing it back to sex trafficking and sexual violence and the 40-hour, that's the benefit of the 40-hour, is bringing into communities that are little Pennsylvanias, Cincinnati, Chicago, Bum F, wherever, or Topeka, Kansas. I'm just, I'm being silly. But for folks that have natives in their urban, rural, or suburban communities, they can join this 40-hour and hear about those invisible folks and how to do sex trafficking through a different lens. It's all basic information. How do you advocate for sexual violence survivors, domestic violence, and trafficking? It has that baseline. That's good for everyone, but it brings in those little cultural aspects that I truly believe will be good for all nations. If they're serving someone who's Muslim or Hispanic or immigrant or refugee, it fits everyone and just opens the mind to the complexities across cultures.
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was a lot.
Oh, gosh. It's all important, though. It's all important.
Yes, it is.
Tia, I'd love to turn it over to you if you have any questions.
I do have one question. Rebecca, can you explain to us what digital sex trafficking is? A lot of people have not heard of that and don't understand what that is and how it ties into sex trafficking.
I think that is a really helpful question for our time today. So particularly that we're still in this pandemic world. We're meeting virtually. I would love to be with you face to face doing this together with folks in the room that can contribute, but we're virtual for a reason, right? The shelter in place and all of that. So the digital aspects of sex trafficking, that has been around since the internet began. So sex trafficking is $1 billion organized crime industry, and it can be done on a micro level with some dude that's a John on the street with 2 trafficking survivors that are his victims right now, right? And it can be that small game. And we know through Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, it can be an international high stakes sex escort service that can be billions of dollars every single year. So the internet has always been a part of that buying and selling process. What the pandemic has done is put us in our homes, safely shelter in place, all the politics aside, right? We had our ordinances and our mandates. Traffickers were losing money on the street. Let me back up. Before this happened, we had Backpage. That was the main sex trafficking website that was literally mainstream. It wasn't the dark web, the black web. It was just every day, like Craigslist.
Yeah.
So we had these, and we had a lot of Native women leading the charge against Backpage. So the president at the time did sign that Backpage was going to have to be responsible. What is our reality as trafficking advocates? When we know what's going on, we start fighting to end it, they already long been working on a different plan right out of the gate. It happened before we even had pen to paper. They were already masterminding what's coming after Backpage because they were going to lose their money. This is organized crime, including the mafia, cartels, Indian gangs, all the things. So digital sex trafficking, unfortunately, because of the mainstreaming of our internet in our world, turned into really big websites, Facebook, all the time. There are traffickers that are forcing people, if they can't make their money on the street in life, they're going to work 50% on the street, they're going to work 50% online, and that's their new quota. And that's the reality. Instagram, Twitter, and we know OnlyFans. And this isn't a well-researched that I can provide a resource, but someone did a review at the basic level that 80% of OnlyFans is sex trafficking victims. 80% of those folks on OnlyFans. And OnlyFans, it's for folks that don't know, it's a subscription service. You find someone you want to follow. They post videos and photographs. It can be $2 to $18 a month. But traffickers are forcing those in their kennels, quote unquote. That's a harsh language, but I'm keeping it real with y'all. That's what it's called. Mm-hmm. People that are in the kennels, they are forced to do their sex work face to face, which is a sexual violent crime, through force, fraud, and coercion. But then if they're not making their dollars out there to meet their quota, they're on OnlyFans, or they're reaching out to people cold calling on the internet. So this pandemic is tragic. Even in my family, we've had loss, and in our communities. But for sex trafficking, they're working 2 jobs now, forcefully, and it's really tragic. And the thing I'll end with is that subscribers that are paying that monthly fee to see what they see, and they're not doing any physical touch, so it doesn't seem as violent up front. Behind the scenes, it quite is. Those people that are making those profiles are anonymous, or no, they're public. The buyers are still anonymous. So it could be our senators, our congressmen, our mayors, our police department. They get to buy without tracking. But the people selling, they got to put their names out there. I'm going to take a breath.
Wow. Luv Bay, we want to welcome you again to Suffering in Silence with Tia May on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We're here every Friday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern, with a replay on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern. We're rising out of the ashes together. And again, our topic on this evening is sex trafficking and domestic violence. We want to take a moment to share some more resources. For information on male sexual abuse, you can reach out to the website www.malesurvivor.org. National Sexual Assault Hotline, their number is 1-800-656-4673. We have Strong Hearts Native Helpline. Their website is www.strongheartshelpline.org. Their phone number is 1-844-762-8483. And we have the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. Their website is www.miwsac.org. And their phone number is 1-877-995-4800. And with that, Jen, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, Rebecca, I love what you were talking about with the OnlyFans, and thank you for asking that question, Tia, about digital sex trafficking. I think there is a very common misconception that anybody that is on these platforms is doing it by choice. You know, somehow the technology, the digital aspect of it, for some reason it's like, well, now people aren't working under a pimp, like they're doing this, it's empowering. And so I would just love to spin that conversation a little bit, to talk about the lack of consent that is often on these platforms, and how much of that really is people, women and men, being forced or coerced into this line of work. And just because it's not on the physical street, not, that doesn't really matter anymore. The technology is there. And while there are good uses for technology, there's also always going to be the insidiousness of it as well.
Yeah.
That's very true. There's an assumption, let's think about, boy, this is hard language. I don't want to say basic because that's connected to another word that sounds really bad, but there's the mainstream, everyday folks that are embedded in other careers and their worlds are different. So they don't know this language that we take for granted that we understand. They understand the movie Taken, that there is this intricate, somewhat young person goes on vacation. If you haven't watched the movie Taken, it's a great foundation that's entertainment but still tells a story, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll Google it on our next mini break. There's one that's specific to Indian country and rape and sexual assault, specific to prosecution and investigation for Indian folks, which is a totally different world than the rest of America because we are independent countries as sovereign nations.
Yeah.
But, so Taken lays out the groundwork of how complicated trafficking is with substance abuse to drug them and steal them, 12-year-olds, 8-year-olds, right? And people at any age and any gender, the LGBTQ community, women, girls, men, and boys, right? And runaways, all the things. But when it comes to the digital trafficking, man, if you think about sheltering in place for 8 months and staying inside and are quarantining, kids that aren't in school where teachers can see, wow, my student's behaving a little bit differently. Or someone in the library that's showing signs of distress with someone who's oppressive and violent towards them. All of these mandated reporters have been taken out of the loop on a regular basis, let alone police officers on the street seeing victims who need help. They're not there because they're online. So it comes with all of these complex barriers where someone could be held hostage. And let me back up. At the end of the day, sex trafficking is enslavement.
Yes.
It's Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So let's give honor where honor's due. This includes labor trafficking, right? Yeah. Human trafficking, sex trafficking, and all forms of enslavement that are present in 2022. When it comes to sex trafficking, all of these mandated reporters, all of these protections out at the grocery store, at the bank, at the ATM, everywhere. Mandated reporters are invisible because they are stuck in their home. And that's why digital trafficking is so successful, because no one could possibly be around to monitor and make a report. And that's what's really scary. So a small storytelling too. I have to maintain confidentiality, of course, but there is a reservation close to a city. Through Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat, someone identified youth, a teenage girl who was clearly not in school because it was shelter-in-place time where the country was shut down, as it should have been, to protect our people for health and wellness. So this recruiter groomed through weeks of flirty conversation. You're so pretty, blah, blah, blah. They knew they were on a reservation and groomed them to become, before they even met a recruiter, to recruit over a dozen other youth on the reservation that weren't in school at the time through social media and digital means, to recruit a whole group of other teenagers to run away for quote unquote an exciting trip to the city. And the city was 90 minutes away. Then those groomers and recruiters through social media met them. She enticed all of these bored teenagers, because school was out, to quote unquote run away to go to the city for a fun time. Drove to the reservation, filled a van with these young teenagers, drove to the city, and they trafficked them. It was horrific, and it all came through social media, right?
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. And the stories that if we break that down into a constellation of stars of the outcomes, it is so heartbreaking because the youngest was 12.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it all came through the internet. So I guess I'll take a breath, but to say that parental monitoring of the safety of our children, we teach them to look both ways before they cross the street. Don't talk to strangers, but we're not monitoring their social media. We need to cross that bridge somehow.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important comment, because as we get further and further along in our society and technology, it's just not going away. It is part of life, and it is going to be a part of life. So you can't anymore say, well, I'm just going to cut this off. This isn't going to be a part of my life, because that is very rarely something that anybody can do in this day and age. So really understanding how the shift needs to come in how we monitor that kind of stuff for younger people, and for even friends, keeping each other accountable and keeping each other safe, and making sure we know what's going on in each other's lives, because there is such a disconnect between talking to somebody in quote unquote real life and talking to somebody on the internet. Literally anything can happen when it moves to the internet, like your story, Rebecca. I think it's really interesting too. So as we're talking, I keep thinking about this book that I read about a decade ago. It's called The Slave Across the Street, and it's a memoir by a woman named Teresa Flores. And I don't know if either of you have read it, but it changed my perspective of what human trafficking or sex trafficking looks like. You had mentioned the movie Taken, and I think that's what everybody's thought is in their mind when they talk about human trafficking. But this is a story about a woman she was a teenager, and she lived in a rural, not a suburb of a large city. I think she was in high school, and her dad was like a local politician, I believe. Please forgive me if any of these details are wrong, but because it has been a while since I read it. But the story is that she got involved with this guy, and he took pictures of her and then threatened to show them to her father or leak them. And she was a teenager who was afraid of the social and parental backlash. And so for 2 years, they trafficked her out of her home. I mean, she was used as a sex slave, but she still lived with her parents. She would go to school during the day, and at night they would come get her and drive her around the city and deposit her, in different places to be used. And so I think that really changed my perspective on what that type of abuse looks like, because it really doesn't take this whole grand scheme, this ring of educated and well-planned traffickers to execute something like this. It really is just about power over other people. And so when you look at it like that, it's just a completely different issue. And so looking at something like that could happen to anybody, right? Like something like that could happen to anybody we know, could happen to any of us. And so we like to separate human trafficking or sex trafficking as something that doesn't really happen around us, or nobody in our circle is vulnerable to. And the reality is that we're all vulnerable, right? Anybody is vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. I think it's another one of those issues that unfortunately people want to close their eyes to. We want to close our eyes to domestic violence. We want to close our eyes to sex trafficking. We want to close our eyes to children being abused, as if ignoring it or staying silent is going to make it go away. And it's not. We need to realize and take our responsibility and speak up and do something and say something when you see that something is obviously not right. And even if you have, just that feeling, or, just that little thing, that just happens sometimes, I would rather be wrong, than to say nothing and then find out later this child was seriously hurt or murdered or taken advantage of in some kind of way. So we have to stop closing our eyes. We really do. And listeners, another resource that Rebecca shared with us, it's a resource for a parent-teacher monitoring the internet. It is www.cybersafetycop.com. And again, it's a great parent-teacher resource for monitoring the internet use and danger apps for our young people. We wanted to share that again, www.cybersafetycop.com. I want to ask you, Rebecca, what are some of the sexual violence prevention efforts of your organization, especially towards teenagers? So what are some of the things that your organization does to try to get ahead of it, to get information to young people, to make them aware and try to keep them safe?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So we try to fully decolonize our place in the movement, which is bringing back the traditional values, which is wisdom, bravery, honor, humility. We have the 7 Lakota virtues, but each tribe is a unique nation, right? So they have their own virtues, but they're pretty similar in, that context. So we want to decolonize and bring in the youth with 360-degree mentoring, where youth can come in. We don't talk at them or to them, we talk with them, and then they get to mentor us. They know the world they're living in, right? Mm-hmm. So they need to inform us as advocates. So I can't say it enough. I am so honored to be a part of this organization. They've been very progressive with the safe harbor laws in Minnesota. Diversity. We also know George Floyd happened right there at Ground Zero where our office is. So we're doing anti-Blackness work and diversity work. And when we talk to our youth, we really want to meet them where they're at, but also do community engagement. We have a coalition, a tribal coalition in Minnesota, just for that state, each state, or tribal coalition works with multiple states. It depends how many tribes they have. So MILSAC works with the tribes in Minnesota as a tribal coalition TA provider. So we want to provide training and technical assistance to the coalitions with information on community and engagement and things like visioning meetings and membership meetings. So they say the ground up, but it isn't. It's from the grassroots down to us, so we can inform the work, if that makes sense. We need to change the language of that hierarchy to really engage at the grassroots level, including youth and adults. So we do some youth podcasts or webinars. I don't know what platform we use, but we've had youth engagement for murdered and missing, where they come in and teach adults, you're going to do this work. This is what the youth are saying. So they have the voice to train the advocates, even at the national level, all the way up to federal public policy language. The youth have to tell us what to do. If we're going to talk about them, they need to be a part of that conversation. So we really try to be aware of that. We've done men and boys and LGBTQ work. So we try to be really inclusive, that if we're going to speak about folks in prevention and education, they need to be leading the conversations at the table. And that's very tribal and indigenous decolonized thinking, but we want that to happen everywhere. We have to, I think, this movement we're in right now is 40 years old. I'm 46, so I was 6 years when this movement started. And it started with the language, the battered women's movement. It started in a bathroom during Senate and Congress in DC with a Native woman named Tilly Black Bear and other people. I don't have the full list, so I'm just going to shout out Tilly because she has passed on and she's an auntie to us all. Women stood in the bathroom and said, what are we going to do about violence against women? And they birthed, as a group of women, this movement. So I want to give a shout out to that. They birthed it, but it has to keep growing and evolving.
Right.
Battered women no longer is applicable. It doesn't work anymore, but that's where it started. We need to keep evolving and changing with the times. So I'm really grateful that you brought up the digital piece. That's an evolution of where we're at today. And I guess my answer to the question is bringing youth to each of the tables of engagement and outreach. We can't do it without the youth because they know what's up. Thank you.
That's incredible. I love that. I want to see that everywhere.
Yeah, it's amazing. Jen?
Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. That was just, I'm just really in awe of the approach. It's not seen very often, and it's not seen very wide. And, I don't know much about Indian culture. And so this is all very much a learning experience to me, and I'm honored to sit here and learn. But I love what you're saying about bringing it back to the roots and decolonizing and saying that this is how it has always worked for us, and we're going to continue to fight in this manner. So thank you for sharing. That's beautiful. In that note, I would love to hear, I know that you have absolutely sprinkled in what your work is and how it affects your community. But I would love to talk more about the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement and what that looks like and how we can be allies for that.
Thank you. So the Department of Justice has, and the government has started a Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls project. However, we're modifying that language to just say relatives at this point because we know it includes men and boys and the two-spirit, non-binary community, all of the things, right? Minnesota has a project as well. The conversation all started rightfully through the Highway of Tears in Canada, where I don't know if some of the listeners know, there's a very long highway in Canada with a lot of hitchhiking close to what are called bands. They're not tribes in Canada, they're bands and First Nations. People were hitchhiking going missing. There were over 500 missing First Nations, Indigenous women that were not even investigated. But yet, if a Caucasian, I'm just speaking truths here, if a Caucasian woman went missing on that highway, there would be a full investigation. It took 40 plus years to even raise the discrepancy issue. Giving homage to the warrior families in Canada that lost their children, it came down to the lower 48. And now we have this language called murdered and missing Indigenous people. It came from Canada, from that highway of tears. And it is, the topic today is domestic violence and trafficking. And that's brilliant with this question because missing and murdered is connected to domestic violence issues, sexual violence, sex trafficking, substance abuse, homelessness. It's all the things. So murdered and missing is a jurisdictional sovereign nation issue. It's a racial issue. When folks hear the words, you can go to the reservation instead of going, you'll have to excuse, let me think about this for a minute. I offer this in the black and whites of it all. In the 1990s, if you wanted to have a sexcapade that you could pay for in tourism, you could go, I'm not even going to say names, you could go to a different country and pay someone for your sex tourism experience. When the word got out that Indian country no longer had jurisdiction to arrest non-natives, they just stayed in America and paid $300 to pay for gas instead of $5,000 to go to Asia. And they would come to our reservations and do beating and raping and child molestation and all the things, right? So that's hard to name and say out loud, but this is the truth. I just want to lay it down as truth.
Yeah.
Yes.
Indian country became the gray zone in American law, where you could do whatever you wanted, and tribal police on site could not arrest you because you were non-native. And that's due to Oliphant and Susquamish. Anyone wants to Google that, where I'll give you a brief summary of where this all started, because it has affected domestic violence cases, rape, trafficking, gang rape, all the things.
Yeah.
2 non-natives went drunk driving on a reservation for a heyday in the 60s. And tribal police arrested them. And the non-native said, you can arrest me, you're a dirty Indian. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, okay, because of this case, we are going to take away tribal jurisdiction over anything that happens on your reservation. So a native ain't never going to arrest a non-native on your sovereign land. Many native families sat at the table that night when that news came out and said, oh my gosh, because they got it. That meant that Indian land was a free-for-all, and the traffickers still know that today. So I apologize, that's a lot of harsh language. We only have what is called a sliver of a full moon, which is actually a Broadway show by Mary Catherine Nagel. A sliver of a full moon is a Broadway show that has been presented to the United Nations, that tribal jurisdiction over this violence is a sliver of the full moon, which means you have to have a courthouse, this many police officers, you have to have all of these qualifiers for a tribal police officer to arrest a non-native on Indian land. It's intense, like, what? But this is what it is, and we're still fighting for our sovereignty. Since the early 70s, late 60s, we still cannot arrest a non-native person that hunts on the reservation. That's a lot of information. I wish I could go deeper, but this is what we're dealing with. Trafficking, when they come onto our res and they domestic violence, all the things, we still cannot arrest them unless we qualify in our courthouse structure. We can't arrest them. And, anything outside the reservation is a federal investigation, which we know how that can go. That's a lot of info. I went down a rabbit hole, but I hope that just planted a seed to the reality.
Oh my goodness. No, please don't apologize for information, because it's so necessary. Again, this is something that I feel, we don't learn about this, and I'm very humbled to sit here and learn from you, and I thank you for giving your energy and your time and your resources to do so, because you certainly don't have to. But I think it's so important to hear these things and to use the language. It is what it is. These are not fun, sweet things that are happening.
Right, exactly.
They're brutal and they're awful, and they're huge miscarriages of justice that have been going on for literally hundreds of years. So please don't shy away from the language. I think it's really interesting that the Department of Justice has this, you said this case or this opening right now, the murdered and missing, but the juxtaposition of you not having your own sovereignty. So how does that even work? that the Department of Justice can create this this thing to kind of, is it a virtue signaling thing? Is there actually good work being done? Because from what it sounds like on your side of it, from your perspective, there is so much that has to happen for your own autonomy.
I'm trying to find the website to put it in our chat, but yes, so there has been some leaps and bounds. We know we have a sliver of the full moon of restored jurisdiction from the Oliphant and Suquamish tribe back in the 60s and 70s. Murdered and missing. Wow, I don't know if I should say that. It's the battered women's movement from 40 years ago that launched. Right? We knew domestic violence had launched, and we started protecting our women across all of our nations. Then sexual violence came, and the things like rule of thumb, that you couldn't hit anything wider than the width of your thumb. We stopped saying that as a motto or cliche or whatever, colloquialism. Murdered and missing then became a hot topic and a social media trend, which is wonderful. Right? Trends can be wonderful. Sometimes they're not, but sometimes they're good educators. So the murdered and missing did take off, thank goodness, because our communities across Indian country, whether they were in the mountains, in the country, in suburbia, urban settings, or the reservation, we started this movement. And I want to give note real quick to Gabby Petito.
Yeah.
She has elevated, bless her, lifting her in smoke and prayers, and her family for the work they have done to elevate both domestic violence and murdered and missing, right? Because sometimes it just takes the big story to hit the airwaves in mass media. So I want to give appreciation to them and the family for continuing to lift the story. With the offices that have been started in, the White House, that reach Congress, that reach our states, there's a lot of work to be done because of that sliver of a full moon, because of the grassroots voices that need to be integrated. But we have to start somewhere. Yeah. So is the system imperfect? Hell yeah. It's imperfect, but it's something to start with. And when we have a seed planted, it's going to grow. And one thing that I will say, Indigenous people have been involved in those offices. And that's the difference between 1982 and 2022, where even in a BIA, there was not an Indigenous voice in the BIA or government offices or Senate or Congress. Now we have diversity even in the White House in the current administration, and that is leaps and bounds. So we're growing in the right direction. For Minnesota, our executive director, Nicole Matthews, please check her out. She's on the MilSAC. She's on Facebook and our website. She's involved in the murdered and missing out of Minnesota. And I don't want to toot our horn because I'm here in the mountains of Pennsylvania. I'm so far east, I can't even see them. But I'm so honored to be a part of Minnesota because it's been so progressive with Safe Harbor, the Garden of Truth Report, and the murdered and missing offices that are sprinkling throughout the country. She did a TED Talk also recently, if you want to Google Nicole Matthews and TEDx. There's a lot of work being done. And if it includes Indigenous people, or Black people, or Hispanic people, or transgender people, it's for them if their voices are present and they're at the table. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, but we're still growing. Still fighting the system, though. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Always. Always. Man, Rebecca, I just want to thank you. You've been such a pleasure to speak with. And again, thank you for your resources and the information that you had to offer. I certainly got an education tonight, and I'm really thankful.
I want to thank you so much as well. I have learned... I've learned some great information. I thank you for sharing. I thank you for sharing the truth. And I think we need to keep doing this. We need to keep speaking the truth. We need to keep sharing information we need to keep breaking the silence across all boards. So, Rebecca, I thank you again for being with us. Luv Bay, I want to share the information again. Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. The website is www.miwsac.org. The phone number is 1-877-995-4800. Please visit the site for their resources. Please also visit the site to provide funding, because I'm sure that could be used to help their efforts. If you want to catch up on previous episodes from the program, you can visit our YouTube channel, Suffering in Silence DV. We thank you again for joining Suffering in Silence with Tia May on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We're here every Friday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern. We're rising out of the ashes together. And I thank you again, my co-host Jennifer Peterkin, and our guest on this evening, Rebecca Baylog. Good evening.